vice, chaos, despair. That's all visitors mention when reviewing their trip to Baltimore. No longer a luxurious restaurant, a dazzling harbor, or the echoing sounds of jazz music. Instead, their memories are etched with a gaping crack, swallowing the entire city in chaos and despair. Once called the Pearl of the East Coast. But today, returning here is like stepping into a broken-down city. Tents stretch out like roofs, and sidewalks have become temporary sleeping places. As night falls over the city, the streets become traps, lurking for both residents and police, where just one small mistake is enough to make anyone a victim. In this video, you won't just see the cold numbers of thousands of homeless people. You will be guided through the forbidden zones between the city center, where normal life seems non-existent, and discover the stories that Baltimoreans don't want anyone to know. This bitter paradox will make you look at Baltimore and any city standing on a similar fault with completely different eyes. Do you remember the last time Baltimore was called a dream city? It's been too long to revisit that memory, especially since in recent years Baltimore has built an image as a city on the brink of chaos. The once bustling streets are now a land of vice and despair, where rows of tents have replaced rooftops and the stench of unknown substances permeates the alleys. Wealth and poverty clash every square meter, hidden interests rise, and chaos spreads to the point where nowhere is truly safe. Every step outside is a wake-up call, and every night reminds us that Baltimore, once vibrant, now survives only through the vigilance and caution of its residents. The city that yearned to lead the East Coast, that once wanted to be a model for other cities to follow, is now a thing of the past. For over half a century, this place has been called the capital of toxic drugs. And now, the wandering shadows that fill the main streets are the clearest proof of this. They staggered, their eyes were blurry, and their gait was unsteady. Some people collapsed right on the sidewalk, motionless amidst the traffic. Perhaps it was those very toxins, combined with unhealed traumatic memories, that became an invisible anchor holding them back from a life filled with turmoil. Many people can't escape. They are tightly drawn into a vicious cycle with no way out. But the unease didn't stop on the street. Residents recount that sometimes, as soon as they opened the door, they would find a figure standing right on the doorstep. That moment felt like a blow to reality. The home that seemed like the last bastion was now separated from the chaos outside by only a thin door. For an ordinary person, that sight was enough to make their whole body tense, because no one knew whether the person in front of them was just seeking shelter or carrying a hidden danger. The biggest concern is uncertainty. The homeless, the rootless, driven to despair, and that very despair could erupt into uncontrollable actions. People understand that today might just be a shadow at the door, but who can be sure that tomorrow that door won't be thrown open? When the safety net disappears, the only question left is, how long can they protect their roof and their families? When I go out, that fear intensifies. People are forced to change their habits, park further away, take detours, and avoid hot spots, even if it takes extra time. For them, it's the only way to hold on to a piece of peace in the city. However, the roots of instability don't just come from the people wandering the streets. The very land on which Baltimore is located is also the trap that makes it difficult for the city to escape. Located along the I-95 corridor connecting Washington and New York, and boasting an airport, hotels and casinos, Baltimore has become a place where wealth and poverty collide head-on, creating fertile ground for the underground market to flourish. The enormous profits turned this city into a lucrative target, attracting people from far and wide to start a business. In this vortex, everyone is helpless. The fallen one slides down without brakes. The people went from sympathy to fear, and then retreated into silence. Police admit they are overloaded, and in many neighborhoods, they just turn on their car lights and drive through. And instead of offering a strong solution, the government chose to advise, if you've used it, don't use it alone, have an antidote ready, and call emergency services if you show signs of shock. For many residents, that message was like hanging a sign that said, "We can't control it, fend for yourselves." It turns fear into anger, because a policy called safe is like accepting that darkness will persist. In those circumstances, people could only live with the flood. They protect themselves, keeping their children and families away from the dangerous vortex. But the consequences still weigh heavily. Asset values decline, small shops lose customers, and the old neighborhood is deserted. Children grow up in an atmosphere of insecurity, while the community is tense, where hope is gradually replaced by caution. Today, Baltimore is like a dying body, still breathing, but with a chaotic heartbeat. For the golden generation, it was a heavy blow from past confidence to present chaos. If a city that once proudly called itself Charm City has become a symbol of despair, what awaits its most vulnerable residents? And if even the roads that once symbolized the American dream are now temporary shelters, what can we leave for our children and grandchildren? Baltimore is facing an undeniable reality. The issue of homelessness has exploded into a public crisis. Tents crowded the sidewalks, parks became shelters, and underpasses became makeshift homes for thousands of people. What was once considered an exception is now the everyday face of the city. According to the 2025 HUD report, Baltimore has over 6,500 homeless individuals, an increase of nearly 15% in just 3 years. To make it easier to imagine, we'll calculate it like this. With a population of approximately 570,000 people, 6,500 homeless individuals is equivalent to the entire population of over 60 neighborhoods living on the streets. Imagine this. If you were to walk through a densely populated district, instead of seeing houses packed together, you would only see tents and the shadows of people wandering aimlessly. This is the reality Baltimore is facing. Delving deeper into the structure, nearly 40% of these 6,500 people are elderly or disabled. That is, this group alone has about 2,600 people, equivalent to the population of a small town, but they are all living in temporary, unsafe and hopeless conditions. The 15% increase in 3 years is also not a random fluctuation. This means that on average, Baltimore adds nearly 300 to 400 people to the homeless population each year. If this trend continues in just a few years, the number of homeless people could exceed 8,000 tiles, equivalent to an entire city within a city existing in parallel with the prosperous central district right next to it. The noteworthy point is that this issue is not new at all. Baltimore has faced homelessness crises multiple times over decades, but the measures put in place have largely been temporary and piecemeal. It's like putting out a fire without ever figuring out why it keeps flaring up. And it was this lack of thoroughness that transformed homelessness from a scattered phenomenon into an inherent part of the city's landscape. And when the summer heat exceeded 110 degrees, the crisis became more severe than ever. The homeless lay sprawled out in the scarce shade, facing the risk of dehydration, heat stroke, or collapsing at any moment. Many people share that this is not just a physical challenge, but a form of mental trauma. They didn't feel safe in the temporary camps. Paradoxically, it was on the streets, the harshest place, that they felt less at risk. The specific faces say it all. A 68-year-old veteran, after a lifetime of service, now sits in a temporary tent because his pension has run out for medication. A 72-year-old woman, a former teacher, cannot afford rent on her meager pension and is forced to live on the streets. Those stories are not just personal tragedies, but also a warning about the fragility of all social classes. Experts have repeatedly affirmed long-term housing is the only real solution. However, the current temporary camps are just like band-aids placed over deep wounds. Those who were there say that it can take months to receive support, or it may never come at all. Any help, if provided, only extends to overnight shelter, while the roots remain intact. This crisis has turned into a vicious cycle. The homeless live in fear and trauma, those with homes live in insecurity and caution, and the system struggles with half-baked solutions. And the haunting question still echoes: if even those who have dedicated their lives to the country cannot keep a roof over their heads, who can still believe they are truly safe? People in Baltimore often whisper to each other, "There are streets here that even the police don't want to stop on." That saying sounds exaggerated, but in reality, every night proves it true. The city has areas that have become no-go zones, where the lights of police cars only pass through but rarely stop. Hotspots are concentrated under overpasses around abandoned train stations or on streets that were once bustling but are now dilapidated. There, the homeless community gathers in increasing numbers. And as the numbers increased, so did the conflicts, from minor squabbles and petty theft to incidents that made the whole neighborhood uneasy. Police understand that any patrol could spark a new, uncontrollable situation, and they themselves are exhausted in this endless game. In fact, many opinions suggest that the police force is prioritizing the handling of more serious cases, such as dangerous assaults or incidents of a particularly severe nature, while issues related to homelessness or minor violations are being overlooked or dealt with superficially. In some cases, files on toxic crime are dismissed or delayed simply due to lack of evidence or because the investigation was not conducted seriously. As a result, violations continue to repeat, social ill spread, and public trust in the system is increasingly shaken. To the community, this is like a subtle message that, in these places, the law is weaker than the reality on the streets. That helplessness forced the people to find ways to cope on their own. They avoid crossing those areas at night, opting to drive a longer route just for peace of mind. Some stores closed early because customers were afraid to visit. A shop owner once recounted he called the police multiple times when he saw people loitering in front of his door, but received the response, "You'd better avoid that area." For the residents, that saying was no different from an admission that the city had lost control right on its own land. Social workers, who are expected to be humanitarian bridges, are also not immune to concern. They often travel in groups, sometimes requiring police escort. But they admit limited resources and an unsafe environment make all aid efforts fragile. The consequence was a deep scar left in the heart of the city. On the mental map of the people, Baltimore is gradually being carved out into dark patches, areas they absolutely will not set foot in. Property values plummeted. Belief in the power of erosion. People are gradually thinking about taking care of themselves by installing cameras and erecting fences instead of relying on the system for protection. The heartbreaking thing is that many of those areas were once beautiful memories, where families took their children shopping, where exciting soccer matches were once linked to childhood. Now they have become lands that parents are forced to forbid their children from going near. So-called hot spots are actually evidence of a city that is breaking down. Where it should be safest, it has become the most dangerous place. And the haunting question echoed what is left of a city when even the police don't dare stop their cars in the dark. And if the authorities are still hesitant, where will vulnerable residents turn to feel safe? After seeing these forbidden zones right in the heart of the city, the inevitable question arose: why did Baltimore fall into this spiral? To understand, we must look at the underlying causes, the economic, social, and systemic cracks that have accumulated over decades, gradually eroding the city's vitality. The first problem stems from the economy. Baltimore was once a major industrial and port center on the East Coast. But when the factories closed down in the 70s and 80s, tens of thousands of jobs disappeared. Workers who were once living comfortably on a middle-class income suddenly slid into unemployment and poverty. The city is trying to transition to services and technology, but the gap between rich and poor continues to widen. Those who couldn't keep up with the pace of change were left behind, and they themselves or their descendants became the face of today's homelessness crisis. The second reason lies in the escalating cost of living. Housing rents in Baltimore have increased faster than income over the past 2 decades. A report shows that to rent a one-bedroom apartment in this city, workers need to earn at least $5 an hour, while the average wage in many industries is only around $8. That distance means that even people with full-time jobs cannot afford to keep a roof over their heads. For the elderly, the problem is even more severe. Meager retirement funds are quickly eroded by the costs of medication and medical care. Another cause stems from inadequacies in the welfare system. Baltimore once received hundreds of millions of dollars to build temporary housing and support programs, but the results were like pouring water into a leaky bucket. Temporary camps only provide overnight shelter, not a sustainable solution. People have to wait for months to get their benefits approved, and often it's in vain. And every time a temporary camp is dismantled, the homeless are pushed into another neighborhood, and the cycle repeats as if no intervention had ever taken place. Social causes cannot be ignored either. Baltimore has long been associated with images of poverty and problems that have persisted across generations. A child who grows up in poverty, has an incomplete education, and lacks career opportunities is likely to fall into a cycle of instability sooner or later. Additionally, racial inequality and community division isolate poor neighborhoods, turning them into depressed areas that are difficult to escape. When the education and healthcare systems are not strong enough to create new opportunities, that vicious cycle continues from generation to generation. And finally, the cause lies in the management itself. The city government has been criticized for years for choosing short-term responses instead of addressing the root causes. When public opinion reacted, they organized a camp sweep campaign. As the numbers increased, they set up a few dozen more beds in the temporary camp. But there's no long-term strategy to prevent homelessness at its root, by investing heavily in affordable housing, improving education, or creating sustainable jobs. The power system is also in a difficult position, prioritizing serious cases, leaving behind small issues related to homelessness and hazardous substances, and inadvertently allowing them to spread silently. All those factors combined, turning Baltimore into a pressure cooker. Every time there's a fluctuation, a heat wave, a harsh winter, or an economic crisis, the pressure builds up further and the cracks widen. The painful thing is that the most disadvantaged residents are the ones who suffer the most, those who have dedicated their entire lives but ultimately cannot keep their homes. Baltimore didn't become a symbol of chaos for just one reason. It is the result of decades of accumulated industrial decline, escalating costs, systemic dysfunction, and social division. And the question still echoes: if these causes were never thoroughly addressed in the past, will anything change in the future? Baltimore didn't fall in a day. What we see today, the tents, the hotspots, the unrest, all stems from economic cracks that have accumulated over decades. Like an old bridge, each year, it develops a few more small cracks until one day it suddenly collapses, forcing the city to face the reality that its foundation has weakened significantly. First of all, it's the story of jobs. When steel mills and seaports were still operating, a full-time job was enough to support a whole family, even save for the future. But as industry declined, sustainable jobs disappeared. Today, many Baltimore workers are left with only low-wage and unstable service sector jobs. More than 20% of the city's workforce works part-time or on short-term contracts without insurance or a pension. For the elderly, this means they have almost no opportunity to build up savings. Housing is another crack. Over the past 10 years, rental prices have increased by over 35%, while incomes have only risen by less than 15%. A one-bedroom apartment requires at least $5 an hour to afford, which is much higher than the average wage. This makes it difficult for even families with stable jobs to keep a roof over their heads. A large number of people were forced to leave the center, while those who couldn't relocate ended up homeless. Medical and living expenses only make things more difficult. Baltimore has a high rate of chronic diseases, from cardiovascular disease to diabetes, while the majority of its residents live on low incomes. A few $100 prescription bill is enough to force many families to choose between buying medicine and paying rent. And when you have to sacrifice your home, the chances of returning are almost zero. Real estate also clearly reflects inequality. On one side are skyscrapers and luxury apartments priced at hundreds of thousands of dollars. On the other side are abandoned buildings with boarded-up windows. Housing values in poor areas plummet, dragging the entire community down with them. This disparity not only divides living spaces, but also deepens feelings of discontent among residents. These cracks are not unique to Baltimore, but here they converge simultaneously, making the city a weak point on the map of the American economy. Without a solution, the number of homeless people will continue to increase, and instability will spread further. Some experts believe there is still a way out. First and foremost, significantly increase the supply of affordable housing, implementing the Housing First model, ensuring shelter before considering employment and healthcare. Next, encourage businesses to return to abandoned areas through tax incentives, creating more sustainable jobs. Finally, expand community health services to ensure people have access to affordable medicine, preventing them from losing their homes due to illness. These solutions are not easy, and Baltimore has failed many times. But at least they open up a different direction beside the setup, takedown, repeat loop. If the economic cracks are not mended, all that will remain of the city is a dazzling outer shell, while the inside has rotted. Baltimore is at a crossroads. Continue to let the cracks widen or find ways to reinforce the foundation with long-term choices. Baltimore is at a historic crossroads. After decades of decline from a prosperous industrial city to a hotspot of poverty and homelessness, the biggest question is no longer how bad is it, but rather where will the city go? A pessimistic scenario is that Baltimore continues to repeat the cycle. Temporary camps are set up and then dismantled, billions of dollars in budgets are squandered, and the number of homeless people still increases. At that point, the city would become a negative example for the entire country, a place where social injustice is deeply rooted. Trust in the system is crumbling, and people live in constant vigilance and insecurity. Another more optimistic scenario is to address the issue thoroughly, to view housing not as a charitable gift, but as a fundamental right. If Baltimore adopts a housing first model, ensuring stable housing for the homeless first, and then combines it with job recovery and healthcare policies, it could gradually break the cycle. This is how some other cities have experimented and received positive feedback. It's also possible the city will choose a middle ground: no tragic explosion, but also no root cause resolution. At that time, Baltimore will continue to live in division: on one side, glittering skyscrapers, and on the other, rows of tents clinging to the sidewalks. It will be a city that exists with two faces, constantly reminding residents that the American dream can disappear at any moment. No matter what scenario unfolds, Baltimore has become a mirror reflecting the entire United States today. It shows that when the economic foundation cracks, when the social safety net is patched together, even a city once known as Charm City can become a symbol of chaos and helplessness. Baltimore is not only struggling for itself, but also reminding the entire United States of the price to be paid if those cracks continue to be ignored. Baltimore today may reflect deep cracks in society, but it is also from the darkest places that new hope often ignites. Despite the growing number of homeless people, small communities still don't give up on each other. Churches open their doors to those in need of shelter. Volunteers bring food and clean water right to the sidewalks, and young doctors spend their weekends providing free medical care to those without homes. The true identity of Baltimore has never been just factories or skyscrapers, but the people themselves, those who quietly rebuild the circle of care. Hope doesn't come from an instant miracle, but from small steps. A cheap roof built a fair policy, enforced a child given the chance to go to school instead of growing up by the tents. And perhaps when the night passes, Baltimore can still greet a new dawn, not the Charm City, of the past, but a more humane and sustainable beginning. The views and analyses presented in the video are general critical and exploratory observations and do not substitute for any legal, medical, or social advice. Viewers are encouraged to think independently, discuss and consult multiple sources before making judgments or taking action. We respect the human rights, privacy and dignity of every individual, especially the homeless, and are committed to not increasing discrimination or prejudice in any form.